Well, good evening. It's good to see y'all again tonight. We're going to be in Genesis chapter 50 to get started here. Genesis chapter 50. If you would please open your Bibles and we'll start looking there. It's great to have visitors with us again tonight. Thank you so much for being here. And tonight's lesson is, I think, in a lot of ways, a companion lesson to our discussion this morning. I didn't really intend it to be that way, but the two do coincide. And funny enough, neither Bruce nor I nor Keith coordinated on any of these plans, but again, Keith, you chose songs tonight that just perfectly, I think, capture the life of Joseph, his trust in God to lead him through the dark and difficult times that he faced. He found his haven of rest in God, and ultimately, we see the providence of God working in the life of Joseph to not only deliver him and bring him safely to shore, but his whole family as well. And so that's what we're thinking about tonight. How do you react when life doesn't go as planned? Do you question God's goodness? Do you continue to trust that He's still working for your good as He's promised? What if the worst moments in your life were actually stepping stones in God's plan for you? I think Joseph, the history of Joseph, his life, answers those questions, at least begins to help us answer these questions, showing how God is present in every season. If we seek Him and He uses our pain for His glory, and He fulfills His purposes despite human intentions and human plans to thwart His purposes. As Joseph assures his brother near the end of his life, when he's standing there with his brothers, their father Jacob has passed away, and they're concerned now that maybe Joseph is going to change his mind and he's not going to be as kind to them as he has been up to this point so far when they're reunited some 23 years later. He was 17 years old when his brothers betrayed him, sent him off to slavery, and it would be 13 years that he spent in the house of Potiphar, then as a prisoner, falsely accused, and then 10 more under Pharaoh, reigning in Egypt, only second to Pharaoh. So he would be about 40 when he encountered his brothers again. And so they're worried maybe he's harboring bitterness, but Joseph says in verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive." And so I want to take some time tonight to just take 3 points from this great history we have here in the life of Joseph. Point number 1, God's plan prevails. God's plan prevails. And I think what we learn from Joseph is that not only are God's plans unshaken by human actions, by evil intentions, but God's plans are actually advanced through them, even when those actions stem from sin, malice, or ignorance. You think about his brother's betrayal in Genesis 37. We go back a couple of pages there, and we remember Joseph's brothers. They hated him. God had given him this gift of dreams to, prophetically see the future, and he reveals those dreams to his family. Remember of the sheaves bowing down to his sheaf, and the sun and the moon and the stars bowing down to him, and they hate him for this. And his parents are a little puzzled, and we see in Genesis 37:4, his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, and they hated him and could not speak to him on friendly terms. Verse 11, his brothers were jealous of him. His father kept these things in mind as he's revealing these visions that he has. Verse 18, now when Joseph has been sent by Jacob to find his brothers, in verse 18 it says, they see him from a distance, and before he came close to them, they plotted against him to put him to death. So this is how deep their hatred and jealousy runs, right? They're actually conspiring now to kill him. And of course, Reuben says, no, don't do that. And he tries to find a way to preserve his life. And they end up throwing him in this pit, verse 20. Come, let us kill him, throw him into one of the pits, and we'll say a beast devoured him, and let us see what becomes of his dreams. And then some Midianite traders, verse 28, passed by, and they pulled him up, lifted Joseph out of the pit, and sold him to the Ishmaelites for 20 shekels of silver. And thus they brought Joseph into Egypt. And so here you see this point unfolding. Obviously, his brothers, their anger, their jealousy absolutely consumes them to the point they decide to kill Joseph. And they'll say, well, let's see what happens now. Because they don't ever want to bow down to this young man that they hate. But in a great demonstration of God's power, the evil that they commit against Joseph to make it impossible for him to reign is the very thing that actually puts him in a position to reign later in life. Right? That's the power of God to subvert man's evil intentions. His plan prevails. We're not going to throw it. In the rest of the story, it shows that what his brothers meant for ill, throwing Joseph into the pit, selling him into slavery, is the very thing God uses to accomplish what they hope to make impossible. Joseph reigning over them. And that reminds us how God takes the very worst that Satan can do and uses it against him. Uses it to accomplish his own will. And of course, this is, I don't think, anywhere better illustrated than in his only son. God took the very worst Satan could do to Jesus in crucifying him and humiliating him on a cross, and he turned that into the door of life. The door that Satan was trying to slam shut forever, God used the evil intention of men, the crucifixion of his son, to open that door forever. Solomon says in Proverbs 19:21, "Many plans are in a man's heart, but the counsel of the Lord will stand." You know, we go further into the future, we remember another episode, right? Now Joseph, he's in Egypt, he's in the house of Potiphar, this man who's bought him, and he's excelled once more. He's now been placed in charge. He's earned the trust of Potiphar. He's in charge of all of the servants. And Joseph will say, "My master has kept nothing from me." But Potiphar's wife decides that she wants to make advances on Joseph. And he resists and he rebuffs, and he eventually has to just run away, and this leads to these false accusations. So we go further in time. Joseph, he's doing well in his master's household. Genesis 39:9. "There is no one greater in this house than I, and he has withheld nothing from me except you, because you are his wife. How then could I do this great evil and sin against God?" Because she's coming to him day after day, saying, "Lie with me," trying to betray her husband. She is betraying her husband. And then we drop down to verse 17. It gets to this point. "She spoke to him with these words after Joseph flees. The Hebrew slave whom you brought to us came into me to make sport of me. And I raised my voice and screamed, and he left his garment beside me, and I fled outside. And when his master heard these words of his wife, saying, 'This is what your slave did to me,' his anger burned. And so Joseph's master took him and put him into jail, the place where the king's prisoners were confined. And he was there in the jail." So you have more sin of other people. First it was his brothers, of all people, his own family. Then you have his master's wife, the master whose trust he's earned, who he's worked hard for to be pleasing to. He's been given this position of power. And now she's betrayed him and lied about him. And her deceit and Potiphar's anger seemed to derail Joseph's life even further. So it would seem. But where is he put? Yes, he's put in jail. Which one? Where the king's prisoners are held. So instead of destroying Joseph's future, these actions placed him in a position where he would meet Pharaoh's cupbearer and baker, setting the stage for his rise to power. Now we're in the midst of a 13-year span here, and we have the benefit of looking back, and we can zoom way out and view this with the wide lens. That's not the view Joseph had, of course, in the moment. Just when things seemed to be looking up, he's sent to jail. And here he encounters again the cupbearer and the baker. And he rises and excels in this position as well, right? The chief jailer puts him in charge of all things. And you remember that there's a time when these individuals, these king's servants, have these dreams. And they wake up and they're very distraught, and Joseph reassures them that he can tell them what this means. And so he interprets the cupbearer's dream to tell him he's eventually going to be restored, or the butler, your Bible might say, he's going to be restored to Pharaoh's household. Of course, the baker did not get so favorable an interpretation. He was going to be executed in 3 days at the same time the cupbearer would be restored. And so things are looking up again. Here's this chance. Joseph knows the butler is going to be restored. Genesis 40 now, verses 14 and 15. Look what he says here. He says, keep me in mind. Keep me in mind when it goes well with you. Please do me a kindness by mentioning me to Pharaoh. Get me out of this house. For I was in fact kidnapped from the land of the Hebrews. And even here I have done nothing that I should have been put into the dungeon. What happens? Sounds like a great plan. Get me out of here. This is my chance. There's my shot. The cupbearer forgets him. Verse 23. Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph. Forgot him. Chapter 41, verse 1. What's the next thing we read? 2 more years in prison. It happened at the end of 2 full years that Pharaoh had a dream, and behold, he was standing by the Nile. So the cupbearer's forgetfulness delays Joseph's release. Another 2 years. We can see this is not where he wants to be. This is not my plan. I shouldn't even be here. I was kidnapped. An offense, by the way, which eventually becomes punishable by death under the law of Moses. He wants to be back home. He wants to be with his family. But this delay was not a setback, as it turns out. It was not a setback, but a setup. Because Joseph, when he was finally freed, was brought directly before Pharaoh at just the right time, just before Egypt's 7 years of abundance would begin, followed by 7 years of famine. Let me read to you from Psalm 105 here on this point. Psalm 105 is a rehearsal of some of this history, and I want you to notice what it says here. So he summoned a famine on the land. That's God. He summoned a famine on the land and broke all supply of bread, and he sent a man ahead of them, Joseph, who was sold as a slave. His feet were hurt with fetters. His neck was put in a collar of iron, until what he said came to pass. The word of the Lord tested him. And the king sent and released him, and the ruler of the peoples set him free. And he made him lord of his house and ruler of all his possessions. At the appropriate time, God released him. Why? To make him a ruler. To bind his princes at his pleasure, to teach elders wisdom. And so human forgetfulness, seeming from our perspective, and I suspect from Joseph's, seeming like a setback, forgetting him actually was a setup by God. Until Pharaoh would have these troublesome dreams that would remind the butler, oh, there's this man, this Hebrew youngster in prison who can understand these things. And Joseph came to Pharaoh when Pharaoh needed him most, and at a time when his interpretation would bring him the greatest gain. Right? Joseph is thinking in Genesis 40, just remember me. Maybe I can get out of here. That's what Joseph wants. Right? But God says, no, you're not only going to get out of here, I'm going to make you a ruler. You're going to be in a position of power. And all of this culminates, of course, in the preservation of God's people. As Joseph comes to understand at the end of his life, God brought about this present result to preserve many people alive. So just as God used the actions of Joseph's brothers and Potiphar's wife and others to fulfill his purposes, He can use trials, the sins of other people in our lives to shape his plans for us. So do we trust him in hardship? When we face betrayal, when we face injustice, I think Joseph reminds us human plans and intentions, they're no match for God's. We should trust in him with all our heart. Don't lean on our own understanding. Don't try to trace his finger even in providence. Just continue to persevere as Joseph did. And I think like Joseph too, understanding this and believing this in God's power and his goodness allows us to let go of bitterness. And when we're thinking about injustice, when we're thinking about betrayal, or we're thinking about other sins against us. And you see that with his brothers in Genesis 50. And earlier, when they first encounter each other again. Right? He embraces them, he welcomes them, because he has this, hindsight is 20/20, as they say. He understands that this was God's plan all along. And so he doesn't harbor resentment and bitterness. He kisses his brothers, and he wants to help them. He wants to provide for them. He says, I'm going to take care of you and your children. God uses everything, even evil intentions, for his glory and the good of his people. His plan prevails. Number 2, God's presence prevails. I think Joseph reminds us of God's unwavering presence through every season of life, whether it be success or suffering or uncertainty. God is never absent, even if circumstances suggest otherwise. Remember Isaiah 41:10, God says, do not fear, for I am with you. Do not anxiously look about you, for I am your God. I will strengthen you. Surely I will help you. Surely I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. If we pay careful attention to Joseph's account, especially in chapter 39, in the midst of his slavery and imprisonment, God's presence is mentioned repeatedly. And even if I said earlier, we can't trace his hand, only he knows his plans. But we can trust his heart. We know that he intends good for us ultimately. In temptation, and now this is my supposition in Genesis 39 that we read a moment ago. I acknowledge that the text there, it doesn't say Joseph was enticed by Potiphar's wife as she was making these advances, but in this test, we can in the very least see in verse 9 that Joseph was mindful of God's presence, right? As evidenced by his words. What did he say? Master's kept nothing from me except you. Now how can I do this evil thing and sin against God? And so Joseph's awareness of God's presence helped him choose integrity over whatever temporary gain he may have gotten from this affair. And as a side note, this stands in marked contrast to his brother in chapter 38, Judah. Remember, that's the account of Judah going and seeking out a prostitute on the road to Timnah. He doesn't know that it's his daughter-in-law at the time. But Joseph, on the other hand, resists this temptation. And he did so by first refusing to listen or to even be with Potiphar's wife, and then fleeing her when the time came. Solomon says in Proverbs 8:13, the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, pride and arrogance in the evil way, and the perverted mouth I hate. I want to seize upon that first statement. The fear of the Lord is to hate evil. We have true reverence for God. We truly trusted him, love him. This is what it translates to in action. It means we hate everything that's against him. At least we should. And you see that in Joseph. How could I do this evil and sin against God? Again, Proverbs 14:2. He who walks in uprightness fears the Lord. And so Joseph is a true model of these principles, remembering God's presence. Paul tells us in the New Testament we should shun immorality. Your Bible might say flee. Other translations, instead of shun, will say flee immorality, 1 Corinthians 6:18. But Joseph did both. Right? He was refusing over and over again, shunning her suggestions, and then he fled when she didn't listen. And that, of course, led to his imprisonment. And as you look at chapter 39, what you find over and over and over again, in verse 2, in verse 3, twice, in verse 5, twice, in verse 21, and again in verse 23, twice, is the phrase, the Lord was with him, or some variant of that phrase. The Lord was with Joseph, so he became a successful man. The Lord was with him. The Lord caused all that he did to prosper in his hand. The Lord blessed the Egyptian's house on account of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was upon all that he owned. The Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. The Lord was with him. Whatever he did, the Lord made to prosper. It's just over and over again, every other verse, it seems like. So Joseph may have been a slave. This wasn't part of his plan, but God was with him in this slavery, upholding him, prospering him, giving him success. I couldn't help but think of Psalm 1 through 3. It's one of the boys' favorite psalms. They read it almost every singing night at the end of the month. Psalm 1 through 3. How blessed is the man who does not walk in the counsel of the wicked, nor stand in the path of sinners, nor sit in the seat of scoffers. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law he meditates day and night. He will be like a tree firmly planted by streams of water, which yields its fruit in season. Its leaf does not wither, and whatever he does, he prospers. It's a picture of Joseph, right? Wherever he was, in his father's house, in Potiphar's house, in the jail, as a servant of Pharaoh, he prospered. Why? Because he was a man of righteousness. He delighted in the law of the Lord. And God cared for Joseph not by taking him out of slavery, but by blessing him through it and transforming slavery into a vehicle for good. Because Joseph continued to trust him and to draw near to him. God blessed Joseph in slavery and through his duties, not in spite of them. And so we think about God's people today. Followers of Christ don't always experience the healthiest of times, physically, financially, emotionally, wealth, prosperity in this life. In fact, it's likely to be the opposite. And so if your family ostracizes you because of your faith, you find yourself alone, or you find yourself poor or estranged, so was Joseph. Think about his circumstances. He loses his father that he loved. Even near the end of his life, he's thinking about him. That's one of the first things he asked his brother. Is it still well with my father? Think about the isolation. Think about the betrayal. And then recall how many times it said, the Lord was with Joseph. And I think there's another lesson that comes through here. And that's Joseph's faithfulness, as we discussed this morning, his determination, despite how he felt, despite his own circumstances. Because, as we saw a moment ago, it's not that he just dismissed any memory of what happened. No, he knew the history well. He knew what his brothers did to him. He acknowledged that. And yes, he reassures them in life. But you can see in the midst of these difficulties, he wants out, right? As the words of the cupbearer, he wants to be remembered. I shouldn't even be here. And in fact, when he becomes a ruler and he's married and he's having children, Manasseh and Ephraim, the second son, Ephraim, he says, I named him this because the Lord has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction. That's how he viewed Egypt. It's the land of his affliction. But even so, despite the mistreatment and all the pain, as a direct result of his gifts and his faithfulness and being good at what he did and being honest, Joseph stayed the course. he continued using his gifts, obedient to God in whatever circumstance he found himself. He knew God was with him, and he strove to be pleasing to God. And we should do the same, whether we are in a pit or in prison or a palace. God is still God. There's nowhere we can go to escape his presence, nor should we want to. From him we draw strength, and every good thing we have is because of him. We recognize that, and we can endure trials, we can resist temptation, we can walk in integrity as Joseph did. Right? Christians have the same promise from Christ, right? Teaching them, he says in verses 28 and 20, as he gives the Great Commission to teach the world. Remember how he ends in verse 20, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. So again, these things in Joseph's life, it seems like one delay after another, one setback after another, but in fact, God had something better in mind. His timing doesn't often align with ours, and his delays are purposeful. He uses them to shape our character and accomplish his greater plan. He is with you in your land of affliction. Lastly, really, as we've noticed, I think throughout this lesson, God uses suffering. Let's end with this. We may wish it were not true. We may wish there was some other way. But it is through painful and confusing circumstances. These are essential tools of God to bring about a greater good. This is the way. And this is what Peter would have us remember. And example after example in the Old Testament, like Joseph, like Moses, like Daniel, you name it. You're going to see a pattern. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. It's through painful and confusing circumstances that God crafts men into what he would have them be. 1 Peter 2, verses 20 and 21. What credit is it if when you sin you are harshly treated and you endure it with patience? But if you do what is right and suffer for it, and you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. Now notice verse 21. For you have been called for this purpose. We talked a lot about purpose this morning. What is the disciple of Christ's purpose? You have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example to follow in his steps. There may be a clearer expression of what's in store here. Arguably 2 Timothy 3:12. But Peter is saying here, I think, in no uncertain terms, this is the way. You patiently endure injustice, mistreatment, betrayal. This is the way of Christ. And you think about Joseph's example, in those 13 years when he was waiting on God, doing each task before him to the best of his ability, regardless of the unfairness, regardless of the injustice, regardless of the mistreatment, how that trained him to be resilient, like those examples we considered this morning, to trust the word. It was through that pain. And God uses the same school today. This is his purpose for you and me, to refine you. And as we noted in our Bible class this morning, your pain is bigger than you. There's something else going on here that we have to keep in mind. As we've already seen, Joseph's suffering enabled him, brought him to a point where he would save countless lives in Egypt and his own family. Genesis 45:5, he says it again. He told his brothers, God sent me before you to preserve life. And so our trials have a purpose far greater than ourselves. And that is to bring blessings to others. When we are comforted in our affliction, we can in turn comfort others. As Paul says in 2 Corinthians, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our affliction, so that we will be able to comfort those who are in any affliction with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. God can bring blessing and beauty and redemption from the darkest of circumstances. Take Paul as another example of a righteous man who was thrown in jail. And his view of that in Philippians 1:12 is, my circumstances, he says, being in prison, my circumstances have turned out for the greater progress of the gospel. He knew that his pain was bigger than him, that God was using it to bless others. Joseph came to understand this as well, that God and not his brothers ultimately sent him to Egypt. God uses suffering for good. Look at Jesus' death and resurrection, of which Joseph is a type. Jesus was also betrayed by his brothers. His family didn't believe him. His closest disciples, Peter, betrayed him, denied even knowing who he was. Judas, of course, betrayed him. All the others fled. Jesus also suffered unjustly. He was innocent, yet crucified. Jesus also brought salvation through his suffering, but not a physical deliverance, something far greater, eternal salvation. And like Joseph, Jesus forgave his brothers. Those who had turned against him, he provided an opportunity for them to redeem themselves, as he did with Peter. He prayed for the forgiveness of his executioners on the cross. And so Joseph's life ultimately points us to God's power over human actions in the cross. This is one of the first things that Peter preaches in Acts chapter 2, actually. Remember in verses 23 and 24, leading up to that great conviction in that crowd, Peter says that Jesus was delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. You nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. But God raised him up again, putting an end to the agony of death, since it was impossible for him to be held in its power. You intended this. Here's what God brought about. Here was God's result. This was God's plan. And I think Joseph's words in Genesis capture that truth. You meant evil. You meant evil. God meant it for good. Whether it's suffering that is caused by other sin, or just life happening, hardships, spiritual testing, God can use it to accomplish his good purposes. We simply need to trust in him, accept his plan for suffering to refine us. Easier said than done, I know. Whenever I say those words, I always hear that quote about, I've yet to encounter a philosopher that can endure a toothache. But these principles are real, and they're on display in the pages of Scripture. And in our suffering, God can use us to bless others, and we should rejoice in that. Find peace in that knowledge, that no amount of evil or suffering can derail God's good purposes for us. He will bring about our salvation. As we end tonight, and Brother Keith is about to lead us in the invitation song, I hope that you've been challenged by this example, and that as we examine ourselves, where do we stand with our Creator, who loves us, who gave his life for us, who wants what's best for us, and as we saw this morning, doesn't intend for us to stay here forever. He wants us to be with him in eternity. Where do you stand with him? Have you come to him on his terms? He's done everything in his power to redeem you from sin. He came to this earth, he gave his life, he shed his blood, he rose from the dead. And he says, he who believes and is baptized will be saved. He who does not believe will be condemned. Have you done what's necessary for your salvation? And can we help you some way tonight? If so, won't you come as we stand and sing?